Assalamu alaikum dear students, I am Dr. Shahjabeen and today's lecture is about transport of oxygen from the lungs to the tissues. These are the objectives of our lecture. We will discuss the ways in which oxygen is transported in the blood from the lungs to the tissues, and we will compare their amount in the percentages, and we will discuss the role of hemoglobin in transport of oxygen along with the oxygen carrying capacity of blood. You know that gases can move from one point to the another by diffusion, and this movement is always a partial pressure difference from the first point to the next. Similarly, the transport of oxygen from the lungs to the tissues occurs due to the constant circulation of blood, that is in the whole body along with the lungs and heart. And secondly, the basis, the most important one, it is the diffusion. It is due to the diffusion of oxygen that occurs in the direction of concentration gradient due to partial pressure of oxygen. Here are the partial pressure of oxygen that you have to keep in your mind, and these are the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli is 104 mmHg, while in the arterial blood is only 95 mmHg, and the venous blood and the tissue interstitial fluid have partial pressure of oxygen around 40 mmHg. So from the pressures here, it is clear that oxygen will easily move from the higher concentration to the lower one, that is from the alveoli to the tissue, or you can say cell, by the difference in the pressure, partial pressure gradient. And this transport of oxygen from the lungs to the tissues is accomplished by three steps. Number one, that is the uptake of oxygen in the lungs by the pulmonary blood. Number two, how the oxygen is transported in the arterial blood. And third and the last step is how this oxygen is released from the arterial blood to the tissue where it is required for further metabolism. Now, the first step is uptake of oxygen by pulmonary blood, or you can say the diffusion of oxygen from the alveoli to the pulmonary capillary blood. Look at the picture. Here you can see that the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus is 104 millimeter hydrogram mmHg, while the partial pressure of oxygen in the venous blood entering the pulmonary capillary at the arterial end is only 40 mmHg. Why it is only 40 mmHg? Because a large amount of oxygen was removed or utilized during the circulation through peripheral tissues. So the partial pressure difference across here is 104 minus 40, that is 64 mmHg. So, due to this great concentration gradient, the oxygen readily diffuses from the alveoli into the pulmonary blood. And it is very important to note that this process is very, very rapid. And the partial pressure of oxygen rises almost to that of the alveolar air. What is that? That is the 104, from the 40 to 104. By the time the blood has moved to about 1/3 of the distance through the capillary, 1/3, like this. here. This is the graphical representation of the previous discussion. Here you can see above the diffusion of oxygen from the alveolus to the pulmonary capillary at the arterial end, and that this is all due to the pressure, partial pressure difference, that is 104 and 40 mmHg. So the oxygen will diffuse from the alveolus to the pulmonary capillary. Secondary, you can note that the blood becomes almost saturated with oxygen by the time it has passed through 1/3 of the pulmonary capillary up till here. Look, from the 40 mmHg, this is the at the arterial end of the pulmonary capillary, the partial pressure of oxygen, it increases and increases up to 104, like here 104, and the from here a little of oxygen is added during the rest 2/3 of the way. During strenuous exercises, a person may require as much as 20 times the normal amount of oxygen simultaneously due to increased cardiac output. The time that the blood remains in the pulmonary capillary for oxygen saturation is reduced as much as half of the normal. So the picture is like this, that during exercise the requirement for oxygen is more and the time for the blood to be oxygenated is less. So the question arises that how this blood is saturated during exercise. What happens that during exercise the diffusing capacity for oxygen increases almost threefold. That is mainly due to increased surface area of capillaries, and secondly, you know that under non-exercising conditions the blood becomes almost saturated with oxygen in 1/3 of the passage, giving advantage during the strenuous exercises. Even with a shortened time of exposure in the capillaries, the blood can still become fully oxygenated. Come to the second step of transport, that is the transport of oxygen in the arterial blood. Now you know that pressure of oxygen in the pulmonary venous blood is 104 mmHg, but by the time the blood reaches the aorta, that pressure falls to 100 mmHg. And this is all due to the venous admixture. What is venous admixture? It is the mixing of venous blood to the arterial blood. That is, it is the mixing of shunted non-oxygenated blood. That is, the blood has been shunted or bypassed the alveoli for the oxygenation, and now it has been mixed with the oxygenated arterial blood. So due to this, the partial pressure of oxygen falls to low, and from where these deoxygenated, shunted, or you can say the venous blood comes from, it comes from the bronchial veins, from the bronchial circulation that supplies the mainly the deep tissues of the lungs, and secondly from the coronary venous blood flow through the Thebesian veins. And both of these deoxygenated shunted blood directly enters into the left side of the heart in the and mixes with the arterial blood. This is the picture of venous admixture. For your better understanding, you can see here that there is venous blood from the bronchial vein that is directly pouring the deoxygenated blood in the pulmonary vein, and here you can see the Thebesian vein that is also pouring the deoxygenated blood into the left atrium directly, bypassing the lungs for the oxygenation. As a consequence of the input of these vessels, the blood from the left heart that comes into the aorta is less oxygenated than the blood that was coming from the pulmonary capillary. And now the oxygen that has entered into the systemic arterial blood, it is transported in two forms. Number one as simple physical solution, and number two in combination with hemoglobin. Simple solution is dissolved in water of plasma, but the oxygen has less solubility in water, so very negligible amount of oxygen is transported, like only zero point 0.3 milliliter per deciliter of plasma, or 3% in the form of this simple solution. This dissolved form of oxygen obeys Henry's law, that is, amount dissolved is proportional to the pressure of oxygen. So there is no limit to the amount of oxygen that can be carried in the dissolved form if the partial pressure of oxygen is kept high. This is distinct advantage over oxygen transport as oxyhemoglobin combined with the hemoglobin, which cannot exceed a certain limit. Therefore, the dissolved oxygen at high partial pressure, that is at the hyperbaric oxygen, is utilized in clinical practice for the oxygenation of tissue when the hemoglobin gets denatured in certain types of poisoning like carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, the second form in which oxygen is transported in the blood is in combination with hemoglobin. Oxygen combines with hemoglobin in blood and is transported as oxyhemoglobin. 97% of oxygen is transported by this method. Remember one thing, that oxygen combines with the hemoglobin only as a physical combination, and that combination is oxygenation, not the chemical one that is known as oxidation. The oxygenation is a loose and reversible combination, so that oxygen can be readily released from hemoglobin when it is needed. Hemoglobin accepts oxygen readily whenever the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is more, and it gives out oxygen whenever the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is low. During the oxygenation, oxygen combines with the iron in the heme part of the hemoglobin, and each molecule of hemoglobin contains 4 atoms of iron, and this iron that is present in the hemoglobin is in ferrous form. One molecule of oxygen combines with one iron ion of the heme molecule. Since hemoglobin contains 4 molecules of heme, so each molecule of hemoglobin can combine with as many as 4 oxygen molecules. Look at this picture. There is no oxygen combined with this hemoglobin molecule. This state is known as deoxyhemoglobin or T configuration or tense configuration, because the globin units are tightly bound in this state. But when one molecule of oxygen is combined at the 6 coordination position of iron atom due to the phenomena of cooperative binding kinetics, the second, third, and the fourth oxygen, second, third, and fourth oxygen binds easily and quickly. and convert this deoxyhemoglobin into oxyhemoglobin, and that is also known as relaxed configuration or R configuration. During cooperative binding kinetics, when one molecule of oxygen combines with hemoglobin, the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen increases, and the subsequent molecules of oxygen therefore find it easier to bind to the heme molecules or moieties. Even there is 500-fold increase in oxygen affinity. This happens because the insertion of oxygen molecule ruptures all the salt links and changes the quaternary structure of hemoglobin from the tense state to the relaxed state. And that relaxed state is the state which favors oxygen binding. Here you can see the relaxed or the oxyhemoglobin form of the hemoglobin. You can see the oxygen molecules are attached to the hemoglobin. Now regarding oxygen carrying capacity of hemoglobin, 1 gram of hemoglobin can bind with maximum of 1.34 milliliter of oxygen. Now the amount of oxygen that is transported by the arterial blood, or you can say the oxygen carrying capacity of the arterial blood, is 20.1 milliliter of oxygen. And how it is derived: whenever there is normal hemoglobin, that is the 15 gram percent, and the maximum oxygen carrying capacity of hemoglobin, that is 1.34 milliliter. If you multiply it, we will get the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, that is 20.1 milliliter. But due to the venous admixture that we have done before, only 97% of the hemoglobin is available for the carrying of oxygen. Therefore, practically 100 milliliter of arterial blood carries about 19.4 milliliter of oxygen, not the 20.1 milliliter. Out of which we have done it that 97% is transported in the form of oxyhemoglobin combined with the hemoglobin by the process of oxygenation, and 3%, only 3% is transported in the arterial blood as dissolved form or in the solution form in the plasma. Thank you, students, but the topic of transport of oxygen is not completed yet, and we will continue it in the next lecture too. Here is my email address and the books names for your reference.